Have you ever thought about what Kubo might be setting up by making Uryu a Gemischt Quincy through a bloodline inherited from his mother, Katagiri? One narratively positioned to have a fatal consequence? Because 9 years ago, it was that same Gemischt bloodline that Yhwach targeted through Auswahlen. He stripped those he deemed impure of their powers, reclaiming them to restore his strength, and through that subjugation they perished with a still silver clot in their hearts. And that same fatal consequence of the still silver clot was paid off through the still silver arrowhead, which halted the abilities of the one who activated Auswahlen, Yhwach, for a brief moment. With the silver of stillness functioning as a blind spot within the very futures his Almighty should have allowed him to perceive and alter. And if Kubo structures Bleach to have a complementary or hidden layer behind every directly explained part like the Auswahlen of 9 years ago, where the complementary layer is explained through the cause of the Gemischt Quincy's death, then doesn't that make you wonder if there is a hidden layer behind Uryu being the only survivor of that Auswahlen? Not only about how he survived, but also about the aftermath of that fatal survival, a contradiction that Kubo left open. And what made Yhwach name Uryu his successor was a power he saw in him that exceeded his own, a power that led Yhwach to refer to Uryu as the last survivor, only for that survival to become a contradiction. The moment the 1,000-year Blood War arc reveals how Gemischt Quincy died with a still silver clot caused by that Auswahlen. At first, Yhwach's statement reads as if Uryu having complete immunity was how he survived. But that reveal starts to recontextualize it into a misdirection. Once you connect it to when Uryu sacrificed his Quincy powers through Let's Steal. And that clue may have already been planted in Ryukin's wording, with Ryukin describing the power Uryu once had as feeble, hinting that Uryu's power was affected by that Auswahlen. And what seems like Yhwach recognizing in Uryu some kind of power that exceeded his own, appears to be tied to the shrift he bestowed, the Antithesis. But once viewed through how Kubo sets up Bleach in layers, it starts to shift into a possibility of having a hidden layer, one that ties into how Auswahlen formed a still silver clot in the heart of Gemischt, and Uryu's survival as a mixed blood Quincy being the contradiction planted in that plot line, and sets up Yhwach to have a blind spot to his precognition through the fatal consequence of that specific Auswahlen. So if Uryu has traces of still silver, Yhwach's recognition starts to read, not only as the shrift he bestowed, but also as the consequence of his own Auswahlen. The still silver traces his own precognition wouldn't perceive, doesn't it? And it positions Uryu as an anomaly, someone who, despite inheriting his mother's mixed blood Quincy line, somehow survived, but not completely unscathed. And if Soken's diary is where Uryu learned the truth about the history of the Quincy, then it may also be where he learned what caused his mother Katagiri's death, the still silver clot, and where his resentment toward his father, Ryukin, begins to turn into understanding. So when Ryukin delivers that arrowhead, forged from the still silver clot extracted from the fallen mixed blood Quincy. Kubo plants the seed of still silver through young Uryu's memory of watching his father perform an autopsy on his mother's body. And what first seemed like the reason Uryu no longer wants to follow his father's path of becoming a doctor is later recontextualized as Uryu's misreading. The moment still silver is revealed, shifting the scene from autopsy into extraction. So shouldn't that recontextualization extend to Uryu's low blood pressure, rereading it as a consequence of Auswahlen? Because that early detail of low blood pressure that Kubo added in Uryu's character profile starts to read as setup for Auswahlen's consequence in the heart. And the detail of Uryu's heart reacting during the Senjumaru fight becomes significant because the heart is where Auswahlen leaves its still silver consequence. That burst of power activating from Uryu's heart, just as the 9 years needed for Yhwach to regain his power come to an end, starts to feel like a setup for a subtle link between Yhwach and his successor, Uryu, doesn't it? And once you connect it to everything but the rain, how the Ishida family had access to Quincy healing techniques, it starts to imply that Soken as a researcher may have studied the poisonous effects of hollow encroachment on the Quincy and recorded the progression closely enough to understand how it weakens their powers and ultimately leads to their death. An understanding that enabled him to develop a healing technique for a race that lacks hollow antibodies. And yet, Uryu breaks the lore rule by not undergoing hollow erosion, which starts to imply that he may have hollow antibodies, possibly through an intervention made possible by Soken's documented research on the progression of hollow erosion. And the anomaly continues even in the design of Uryu's Vollständig. The lack of a halo sets Uryu apart, and while the reason is not yet known, it may tie back to how in a race that lacks hollow antibodies, Uryu survives hollow exposure. So the missing halo could be another visual cue that his spiritual composition does not fully fit within the standard Quincy category. So whether Uryu's low blood pressure is a consequence of Auswahlen, or whether he was born with a heart that could slow progression towards still silver clot formation as part of a protective countermeasure, either way, the question remains: if Uryu was always an anomaly within his race, and if Soken had access to Quincy treatment that could affect Reishi alongside Kishi, then doesn't that open the door to a prenatal intervention? One that would not only affect Uryu's body, but the spiritual structure forming within it? And the circumstances of Katagiri's death pass through an incomplete narrator. Ishin tells Ichigo what he knows. She was frail, fell ill on June 17th, died 3 months later, which starts to seem like Kubo is using the gap in Ishin's knowledge. And Kubo plants the misdirection in how he frames the apparent causes of Masaki and Katagiri's deaths, even though both were subjected to Auswahlen. Masaki's death is framed as the immediate consequence of being stripped of her powers and left vulnerable to Grand Fisher's attack, while Katagiri's is framed as the natural consequence of her frail body being unable to withstand the stripping of her powers. And the gap in Ishin's knowledge is what lets the still silver clot recontextualize Katagiri's death once it's introduced. Because Katagiri died 3 months later, those 3 months start to function as a time window for the progression of the still silver clot formation process. And if Soken's knowledge of what kind of being Yhwach was had already led him to understand how Auswahlen works and the still silver clot, then that progression becomes what the Ishida family tried to slow, with Ryukin as the doctor monitoring Katagiri's heart, and Soken as the Quincy researcher, trying to adapt a Quincy healing technique capable of slowing it down. But Katagiri's frail body could be why she couldn't endure it any longer. But Katagiri's outcome and Uryu's survival seem to imply a complicated setup, because Katagiri and the other mixed-blood Quincy in the Ishida household were eventually claimed by the still silver clot. Yet in Uryu, that same process seems to have been slowed, turning the difference in their outcome into a contradiction that may imply the reason is not simple treatment, but the way Uryu's interconnected factors make him an anomaly within his race. So, if that same process was slowed in Uryu, then it doesn't make him unaffected. It makes his low blood pressure start to read like an early planted hint of a fatal progression that has not yet fully completed. So when Kubo places Katagiri's frail body detail under the still silver rule that reframes it, it makes you wonder, was she always frail, or is that medical detail concealing another hidden layer, being withheld to connect to Uryu? And if Uryu's anomaly ties back to Katagiri's pregnancy, the frailty Kubo planted in Katagiri starts to read as one of those scattered details, seated inside the narrative from which he could later build connections. And once seen through this lens, that frailty begins to read as the physical toll of carrying an anomaly in her womb. And if Uryu had a prenatal intervention, then Soken, through his documented research and knowledge, may have played a role in what made Uryu an anomaly, leading to whatever enabled him to resist hollow erosion and survive Auswahlen, while those same interconnected factors may have also enabled him to have an innate countershrift to the Almighty. And if Kubo is using scattered details to build hidden layers around Uryu's anomaly, then maybe that same subtext extends to Soken. And once you connect Uryu's survival back to Soken, not only as his grandfather, but as his master, the one who passed down relics of the past and high-level Quincy techniques, doesn't that make you wonder why Soken didn't use Ransotengai, a technique created so decrepit Quincies could continue fighting hollows? If the Quincy treatment tied to Uryu's survival came with a cost, then Soken's death could become another possible consequence of his own power being weakened. And if you look closely to how Kubo was asked whether Uryu's survival from Auswahlen was connected to his grandfather, Soken, only for him to answer that there was a bit of a complicated setup behind it, Uryu's survival stops reading like a simple exception to Auswahlen and starts to feel like a contradiction Kubo built through the Gemischt Bloodline, one he may have been saving for a later reveal. And if that complicated setup does lead back to Soken, then maybe Uryu was never meant to read. As someone entirely unaffected by Auswahlen, but as someone who survived it with traces of still silver in his heart. A fatal consequence whose progression Soken may have slowed, while also preparing Uryu as a countermeasure long before Yhwach ever named him his successor. And once you remember that Yhwach has a blind spot against still silver, doesn't that make you wonder if the aftermath of Uryu being subjected to Auswahlen may still have a role to play in the final core? Or whether it was already hinted at in the manga through the distorted vision Yhwach received from Ugram during the switch. Thank you for watching. Do you think stories ever truly end? Or do they always leave us searching? One story at a time, one sip at a time, until next time.